Good morning. It is 9:28 a.m. on Sunday, March 29th, 2020. I'm Christiana Ellison. I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. It's Sunday, so I'm continuing my rewatch of Cowboy Bebop with session 26, The Real Folk Blues Part 2, the finale. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just distracted by the little dog moving around. He is teething and grumpy right now, so hopefully he won't bark too much. But boy, he is just all in a tizzy right now. Look at this little dog. Anyway, he's like Spike. He just can't let things go. So, if we recall the end of last week's episode, the end of The Real Folk Blues Part 1, Spike, having been told by Faye that Julia would be waiting for him at the place, goes to the graveyard where they were supposed to meet before, and she pulls a gun on him. So we pick up with that conversation where she's holding the gun on him. He asks why weren't you there before? Why weren't you there the last time? And she tells him she was supposed to kill him. She could have, and if she had, she would have been free. But instead, she went on the run, went into hiding, so that she wouldn't have to kill him. And then she suggests they can go on the run together, which we recall, even though it's not mentioned again in this episode, that was Spike's plan originally. He was supposed to, what he wanted was to go on the run with Julia, or at least that's what he said he wanted at the time. And the plan was for them to go on the run together, but this time, when she proposes they go on the run and he seems to agree, nonetheless, they drive to Annie's, which we remember meeting Annie back in the last two-parter, Jupiter Jazz, where we dealt with, Spike and the Syndicate and Vicious and all of that. But this time, Spike's suspicious. People have been there. They go in and they find Annie's been injured, perhaps shot, unclear exactly, but and she confirms, what I've heard is that Vicious has killed all of the elders, but I didn't tell him that I knew where you were. I said you were dead, but she's dying, and then Julia comes in, and so Annie's last moment is happiness that Spike and Julia are reunited. And then she dies, and it's very sad. We liked Annie from the last one, and to see her die really kind of because of Spike, I mean, it's a little complicated. Look at this dog. I'm sorry. For those of you who are here for serious Cowboy Bebop recaps, and you're treated to extra footage of what a 4-month-old corgi in the midst of teething feels the need to do. It's hard losing Annie, but then as Spike goes to collect some weapons, Julia realizes, wait, we don't need those to run away. You want to go after Vicious. And this is important because it's just like how Faye calls him on it later. In theory, back in the original, like the first time he tried to leave with Julia, running away is what he wanted. But now, for reasons of his own that they don't ever quite make it 100% clear to us, Spike's a little bit opaque in that regard. He feels the need to go after Vicious. And is it for revenge? Is it because he feels like he can't leave the Red Syndicate in Vicious's hands because he's too vicious? Is it because risking his life is something like an addiction for him, that he just can't, he doesn't feel alive unless he's risking his own life? Maybe all of those things. But in any event, a bunch of guys come in and they have to shoot their way out of the building and they're onto the fire escape. And we see Julia handling herself pretty well, uh, as well, with a handgun. Um, and at that point, Julia tells Spike, like, if you're not running, then I'm not running either. I'll be with you to the end. And unfortunately, that's not very long, because as the gunfight continues, there's a moment where I believe what actually happens is that one of Vicious's men shoots Julia just as Spike shoots that guy, and he's just a second too late. But it's all framed very quick and a little confusing, almost almost as though Spike is the one himself who shoots Julia. I don't. I think that's intentional, to have it be a little bit confusing there, because in a way, Spike did kill Julia, right? They were supposed to run away. That was what she thought the plan was. And they're not running away because he feels like he has to go after Vicious. And so we see Julia there fall, and it's definitely played as a real, it's a serious moment. And it's interesting that, and I think it's a really neat touch, that when he runs to her, she clearly says something, she kind of mutters something, but we don't hear what she says now. We revisit it later, but at the time that she says it, we don't know. And so Julia dies. In the meantime, in between all of this, we had Faye and Jet back on the Bebop. The Bebop's in rough shape. It can't really go anywhere or do anything to help right now. Jet's still shot in the leg. Faye is kind of challenging him. It's like, how could you let him, go after this woman, and by himself? And Jet's basically saying, this is his own past, and I'm in no shape to help him anyway. There's a moment where he gets defensive and is like, he's nothing but trouble, good riddance, or whatever, but we know he doesn't mean that. And he and Faye are just kind of at loose ends, not knowing, like, well, how they want to help, but they don't know how. This is something Spike's really kind of not letting them in on. And then sure enough, Spike returns to the Bebop at this point, after Julia dies. And there's a moment where he lets them have just a brief moment of normalcy, where he asks Jet, like, you have anything to eat? And, we have a sort of a flashback to the bell peppers and beef, but there's no beef sort of thing, where he's eating it and he eats a lot of it. It's like, it's terrible, but, for someone who doesn't like it, you're sure eating a lot. And they're kind of enjoying that. And then Spike tells a little sort of metaphorical story about a cat that's, lived a million lives, died a million times, but it's only when he meets this other female cat and she lives and dies that he finally cries and dies for the last time. And Jet comments, that's an interesting story, and Spike tosses it off like, oh, I hate that story because I don't like cats. And they both laugh over that because it's a moment of just absurdity, but it's also clear, I think, between them, that what Spike is telling Jet is, I expect to die. I'm going out and I'm not going to be coming back. And in fact, Jet asks, is it for the girl? And he says, she's dead. There's nothing else I can do for her now. And so I think that conversation is important because, in some respects, we could say, why is he going after Vicious? Is it revenge for Julia? Well, I mean, you could say that it was, but it's not really, right? He had Julia. They could have left. We could say just add Julia to the list of things that he needs to kill Vicious for, but I think that's not it. Like he's obviously upset about Julia's death, and maybe Julia being gone makes him feel like he doesn't have anything else. So it's all the more reason that he does want to just leave. Or does have to do this. But I feel like it's, it's when he continues on and Faye confronts him. Why are you doing this? Why do you have to go? And she kind of confesses too that it's like, I got my memory back, but it didn't help because I had no place left to go to, and gets as close as she ever does to admitting that she felt like she had a home there with Jet and Spike and Ed and Ein. She doesn't really mention them, but like she didn't even get to say goodbye to them. And she's just like, why? Why do you have to just go and die and throw your life away? And what he says is, he says, I'm not going to die. I'm going to find out if I'm really alive. Which, obviously makes no sense on the surface level of it. But that, I think, is the clearest insight that, like, he, as we've seen throughout the series, Spike is just constantly unflustered by almost everything. Danger, risking his life in many different ways. But there is something about his past with the Syndicate and with Vicious and with Julia and everything that in some ways it's like that's who he was when he was alive, and when that ended, what Vicious says later is, you're finally awake. And so that's, I think, where he's saying, like, like he wasn't really, this person that we've seen on the Bebop is somehow like not really who he is. And he has to go back because that's who he is when he's alive. I don't know. It's complicated, right? And I think that's part of what makes Spike's story and Cowboy Bebop in general live on the way it has. What makes it so good is it has that sort of that meat to to satisfy the complexity there. In any event, she's basically like threatening him with a gun, like, I'm going to shoot you if you try to leave, but she obviously can't. He knew it was a bluff, and she's distraught because, of course, it's like, she doesn't understand. It's quite possible that no one could understand except for Spike, and he goes off, and to do it. And let's see, I'm trying to remember exactly when Jet goes to, I think actually, you know what? It was earlier in the episode. It was before Spike returned to the Bebop, but Jet, I think maybe he's a little more at peace with it than Faye is, because he had this conversation with the Native American character that we saw last on the Jupiter Jazz, and he mentions the idea of this star again. The star that is the guardian star for any given life, and that eventually the life will end, the star will fall, and that it's Spike's turn soon. But he says don't be afraid of that, because death is going to come either way. And if you're afraid, then it strikes like a predator. as opposed to if you can meet it without fear, it gently guides you to infinity. So maybe that's why Jet's a little more at peace with it. But Spike leaves the Bebop, and we then get action sequence with the big fight charging in. We meet up with Shin again. We had briefly had a scene with Shin and Vicious earlier in the episode where he basically just reported back that that Spike had gotten away. But there's a weird line in there where Vicious says to Shin, "Don't follow in Lin's footsteps." And it's interesting because if we recall, what happened to Lin is that he was so loyal to Vicious that he took a bullet for him and died. So why would Vicious tell Shin not to follow in Lin's footsteps? And I think it's because Vicious knows that Shin is actually loyal to Spike. And he doesn't care or do anything about it. But he's essentially saying, don't die for the one you're loyal to the way Lin did. But it's in vain, because that is what happens. As Spike fights his way into the building, Shin tries to help him, helps him a little bit, but then is killed on his own. It's less obvious that he deliberately takes a bullet, but certainly he does get shot. And then eventually Spike fights his way up. There's lots of visual echoes to previous fights, like the fight in the church and other flashback shots. Spike gets pretty beat up already by the time he even gets up there to Vicious. But they're fighting each other, and there's a moment where, they have each disarmed the other, and they each sort of have access to the other's weapon. And there's a moment where we think, oh gosh, wouldn't that be weird if Vicious used Spike's gun and Spike used Vicious's sword? But there's a moment of pause there where Vicious asks about Julia, and Spike says she's dead. So we finish this now, and it's interesting because according to the Cowboy Bebop wiki, I watched the English dub, but I believe that the Japanese, the English subtitles for the Japanese translation is a little different. It suggests the lines are, Spike says, "Julia passed away, let's end it all." And Vicious replies, "If that is your wish." And that has a little bit of a different flavor, right? Let's finish this versus let's end it all. That's more a matter of, are we saying we're going to close the book on this story versus we're going to kill each other, which always was a possibility. But, was it the intent? Or was it just something that he knew? They both knew that's what was going to happen. In any event, they each tossed the weapon back to the other, which suggests an intent, right? This isn't or at least a sense of, there's enough respect between the two that they wouldn't try to kill the other in a way that's sort of unfair. But in any event, Spike manages to shoot Vicious through the heart, but at the cost of a pretty substantial slash across his chest. Vicious crumples. Spike, we can see him kind of going away, but he's able to walk a little, take a few steps down the stairs to where he sees lots more Vicious's men come in, and we get just this final shot of Spike where he just points sort of a finger gun, bang, and then collapses on the stairs. And thus ends the story of Spike Spiegel, right? As he is going away, this is where we get the flashback of what did Julia say? When she was dying, she said it was all a dream. And he agrees. So what was the dream? Was it a dream that they could run away and not die as part of the syndicate? Everything? The whole life? The world? As we fade away there, fading up into the sky, the title card at the end for all the other episodes had been "See You, Space Cowboy." But this one said, "You're going to carry that weight." And my understanding is that that's a reference to "Carry That Weight," which is the Beatles song that was intended to kind of complete their, their performing as a group, when the Beatles were breaking up. So it's it's an ending song. And there we have it. Cowboy Bebop. A series that kind of blew my mind when I first saw it, because I just, at that point, really hadn't ever seen an anime.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat?
Siri recently has been driving me bonkers with unintentional activation. Where was I? I hadn't ever seen an anime that had such a definitive ending before. And even much like less an anime, but just like other things, like it's one thing to have like an ending, but one that's this definitive. Like theoretically, I suppose, like, if they wanted to make another season, what they could do is have, cut to a shot where he wakes up on the Bebop's couch in all the bandages again, like at the end of the last conflict with Vicious. I guess. But I don't think they would, because that's not the intention. Obviously, they haven't. They did make a movie, but it was set, before everybody left, right? It wasn't a continuation. It was a side story. Yeah, so I mean, this is an incredible anime, and I mean, it's an incredible show, and I think there's a reason that it's kind of regarded as such a standout in the genre, and it's a masterpiece. I think it has a few places here and there that a little awkward, maybe didn't age super well, but by and large, it's just amazing. So, with that done, here's the thing. My plan all the way along was that I was going to watch the movie next week, to the week after this finale. But the thing is, the movie is actually really hard to find right now. I didn't own it on disc already. I have the series on Blu-ray, even though you can watch the series in several places. But the movie is hard to find, including Amazon's practice, which I think is really irritating, of listing things that they don't have available just so that you'll still go to their website and see other recommendations. You can still go to their page for Cowboy Bebop the movie where it'll say this title is unavailable. So I've ordered a disc of it, and it might arrive in time to do a rewatch for next week, but also might not. And so if it doesn't, that's fine. Honestly, the movie, I've seen it. It's a side story. It's good. It's worth watching, but it's not meaningful in the way that this finale is. I mean, it's made, with an expectation that people know how the story ends, so there's a ennui to it. But yeah, so regardless of whether or not next week ends up being Cowboy Bebop the movie, the time has come to start thinking about what is the next rewatch. Well, I've got a couple of ideas. One is that Steven Universe just had its series finale. So that could be a good time for a complete series rewatch. That could be fun. Adventure Time is another one in that same vein that could be fun. There's also Legend of Korra. You know, we did Avatar: The Last Airbender, but what about Legend of Korra? I really liked that show. So that's another one that we could do. Or we could do another anime, FLCL, sometimes called Fooly Cooly. Could be a fun one to do. Or is there something else that any of you would suggest or request? Also, potentially, we could do a couple of weeks of just movies, animated movies that are I enjoy. So, anyway, if you've watched all the way to this point, and it's actually still timely, then let me know what you think. And in the meantime, I'll talk to you all tomorrow for 5 more minutes.